All right. Well, we're super glad to have you join us, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Yvonne Unrau. I'm the director for the Center for Fostering Success at Western Michigan University. And we are here today for a webinar to social work educators. And it's with Alexis and Justin Black on their lived experience in foster care. Let me give you a rundown of how we're going to spend the hour, and I think we're going to have a lot of valuable learning and some rich discussion. I just want to let folks know that my work as a professor at Western Michigan University has involved the privilege of stewarding, building, and leading the Seat of Scholars program at Western, which is a program for youth who have aged out of foster care and beginning their college journeys. And so I met our distinguished guests today, Justin and Alexis. I met Alexis first and then Justin second, both who are not only were students in our program, but are now graduates of Western Michigan University. Alexis graduating in 2019 with her bachelor's degree in business administration, and Justin in 2020 with a Bachelor's of Arts in Communications, Public Relations. So these are two young scholars, role models, and teachers, and they're going to teach us today. The book that we're going to be talking about today, Redefining Normal, is authored by Justin and Alexis, and they're going to be reading some excerpts from that book. There it is, lovely. So if you haven't yet got your copy, this is yay! It got to Canada. So this particular book has its own value just for reading it, but we also want to acknowledge that it actually has value for social work education. So this is a literary novel that shares the story and the intimate details of living through abuse, neglect, the foster care system, and then thriving in relationship, in healing, and career, and in inspiring others. And this particular story fits on all levels of our social work competencies that we aim to teach social workers to prepare for practice. So we can get into that more as we go. But let me say, so I'm gonna let Alexis and Justin introduce themselves, but before I do that, I just want you to acknowledge that we have E.T. Townsend in the background who's doing our tech today. And so E.T. is going to actually be monitoring the chat, and we'll look for opportunities to sort of invite questions as they fit into the discussion. So you should feel completely free to type in the chat. And you might also type in your email, because if it happens we don't get to all the questions today, then we will aim to respond to those questions after the webinar. So use that chat liberally, and ET will be responsible for making sure that your points of interest are noted. We're going to have, after the introduction with Alexis and Justin, we're going to have 3 brief readings from the book, followed up with some questions that I have to get us going. And then we also have time the last 10, 12 minutes of today for open Q&A. So sit back, enjoy the ride, and Alexis and Justin, I will turn it to you for introductions of yourselves.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I'm Alexis Black, as she mentioned, and I am a recent graduate of Western Michigan University. I actually have 2 bachelors, so a bachelor's in entrepreneurship and a bachelor's in global international studies. Justin and I, we met in the Seat of Scholars program actually on the first day of it. And if you read our book, you knew that. But I entered foster care at 13, and that was after my biological mother passed by suicide, and my biological father was physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive of me for 8 years. And I actually had to testify against him when I was a freshman in high school. and I aged out of foster care at 21, and then I was actually adopted at 26 as an adult. So it's a little background.
Yeah, and for myself, my name is Justin Black, as you know, and been blessed and honored to be able to co-write this book with my lovely wife, Alexis Black. And I've entered the foster care system at 9 years old and spent about 17 years of my life in Detroit. So about 17 to 18 years in Detroit, and entered the foster care system to what I would say is largely due to, I think, a lot of trauma and mental health issues being passed down throughout my family, where substance abuse became my parents' reliance and became an abuse for them. And domestic violence became normalized in my family as well, and generational also. So those things being passed down in my family, entering the foster care system and having that experience going home to home, dealing with so much, and eventually landed in a group home in Southfield, Michigan, right outside of Detroit at about 17 years old, right before I went to college. And as I transitioned through college, I was blessed enough to meet Alexis, or transition into college, blessed enough to meet Alexis and to see the Scholars Program. And now we are serial entrepreneurs and able to be authors and talk to you about our experiences as well as his book and how it can impact others. So super excited about that. And thank you, special thank you to Yvonne for this opportunity, and thank you to you all for joining. And one thing I want to add lastly is for those who may have questions after, I'm sure you'll receive our contact information, our email. If you watch the recording and you want to ask us questions through email, feel free to do that as well.
Awesome. Wow. What a treat we're in for today. So we're going to begin with the readings. And so we've got the first reading is actually going to focus on socialization around sex. And if you haven't read the book, I do want to make this one logistical thing available to you, is that the book is written in Alexis's voice and Justin's voice, and they sort of go back and forth in the chapters, reflecting on common concepts and then unique experiences that they've had. So this very first reading is going to be a share that they've selected on the excerpt of socialization around sex. So we'll start with Alexis.
Awesome, thank you. And so if you'd like to follow along, for those that have the book, it's on page 43. And it says, being sexualized at a young age influenced my thinking and behavior. In middle and high school, I would allow boys to touch my private areas and give me tight hugs pretty much every day. Most days I would change my clothes once I got to school. I was obsessed with what I wore. Exposed to pornography at a very young age, I developed a distorted image of what made women desirable, and I made it my mission to emulate that image. The intercourse and the other sex acts I had experienced unwillingly with my father were by their nature violent and dehumanizing. As is common with sexually abused children, I became very good at disassociating, taking my brain outside of the room to escape the horror, shutting off to avoid feeling the pain of it all. But the hugs and kisses I experienced at school offered me actual pleasure and somehow left me feeling loved.
Thank you, Alexis.
Before we read any further, I feel like we should have done this before, that our experiences, if you haven't read the book, if you haven't prepared, I feel like we could have done this a little bit before we jumped into reading, but it can be graphic, it can be pretty challenging, to say the least. And just kind of a trigger warning before we go any further for, so many things of our experiences as it relates to sexual trauma and abuse, domestic violence, and other things that we discussed throughout our book. We have trigger warnings within the book, but I feel that it's appropriate just to give you more of a warning before we go any further with our message and what we have to say.
Thank you, Justin.
So with that being said, I'll be reading my part of the book, and this is on page 61 if you do want to read along. So, my teachers at school felt the impact of my home troubles. As a third grader, I started to be interested in girls. The problem was I went weeks without showering, wore the same clothes, and regularly wore shoes without socks. On top of this, I had no idea how to talk to girls. So I did what I saw guys in the neighborhood do to their girlfriends, grab butts to get their attention. My friends and I would see how many girls' butts we can grab throughout the day. It became a normalized game we would play, almost as normal as tag or hide and seek. They would challenge me to touch the cutest girls. They would challenge me to touch the cutest girls, and I did it without hesitation. My friends in school, my friends in school will always challenge me to do and say the wildest things. I knew how crazy it was, and I willingly accepted. Whatever it took to keep them around and to have me at the center of their attention, I'll do it.
Mm. Thank you both for sharing that part of the book and your lives with us. So reflecting on this, how you each were socialized differently around sex and the ways that it shaped you. If you think back, how did social workers or therapists that were in charge of your care, how did they address sex or sex education with you? And what recommendations would you offer to social workers today who are working with children in terms of addressing sex education? And for the second question, it might be if you want to know, are you speaking about children who have been sexually abused or sex education in general?
I don't remember ever speaking about sex or sexual trauma or anything with my social workers at all. That was just a topic that wasn't addressed or talked about. I remember taking several sort of assessments, but nothing really came from those assessments. I think it was more or less for the state to understand where I am in that moment and maybe my progress from that, but not actual conversations. And then in therapy, we did talk a lot about the sexual trauma because that was something I had to kind of work through. But I actually didn't start to work through that until pretty much college, because when I was going to therapy all through high school, it was more or less to just get through my living situation of where I was. I was placed with my aunt, and it was pretty unhealthy, a lot of verbal and emotional abuse. So I didn't, and I was in an abusive relationship. So there's a lot of compounded trauma there. And so I didn't really get to talk about anything around sex or sex education or sexual trauma really even until almost graduating high school, going into college. And that's when I really started to address it. But I don't ever remember social workers actually addressing it.
Can I just follow up with that, Alexis? Yeah. I'm just curious then, like, so now that you look back and knowing what you know now, like, was there a place for social workers to address sex education with you, or do you have a thought about the fact that they didn't was fine because you had many other things that you were dealing with? What's your thought on that?
I think if social workers sort of leave it as somebody else is going to deal with that, then it may not even get addressed. And so it's always like somebody else will do it, so I don't have to do it. But what if somebody else doesn't do it? And for myself, that really didn't happen until high school or college. And so I think it's really on each person to sort of take initiative and making sure that they're a part of that healing journey. And one of the things that I really wish I knew about for myself was even just knowing about ACEs and knowing about what my score was. I have a score of 10. And I didn't know that until pretty much college. Actually, yeah, college. And so I wish I would have known that, because I could see what I'm predisposed to and all these different things, because I read the list of all the things that I have predispositions for. And I'm like, oh, check, check, check. Like, I have all those. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I feel like I could have saved myself a lot of heartache and trauma to know that because I went through this is pretty much what's the plan for me in my life, just because of that trauma, and how social workers can play a role in that by knowledge, and also just even being an example and talking about these things that are so, I don't know, taboo to talk about at all. And when I moved in with my aunt and uncle, they for sure didn't talk about it. They're more or less those types that they won't talk about sex at all ever. That's just not something that they talk about. And so I'm left then with nobody to talk about it. And so I'm left with really just so many unhealthy examples, whether it's from my past or from media, and how media has really sexualized women. So I'm watching movies, listening to music, all these things. And so I have this view of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be in my body, what that means, what my value is. So I'm getting all the wrong messages. And so I think social workers do have an important role in that, of addressing these issues and having these difficult conversations and not pushing it off to whoever should be dealing with it.
Right, not assuming. So absolutely assess and check in what each youth's need is. Thank you. Yeah.
And I just wanted to add really quick, as far as my experiences, I think with the sex education piece is very important. It can be difficult because, I mean, so many children, like you've read, has been started to being sexualized at such a young age, to where I don't think the education system, I don't think social workers really know at what point should we start to try to involve sex education into lives of youth, at what age, at what time period. And for both of us, we both were sexualized at a young age in different ways, but both at a young age. And I would say just including in the sex education piece of not only just, oh, this person has this part, this person has that part of their body, but starting to include the consent piece. And what does that mean? And what should and shouldn't for men, what should and shouldn't, what is appropriate for you to do, what's not appropriate for you to do, and how to interact with women. Because as you've heard through my experiences, touching women inappropriately from a young age was normalized. And it was a sign of, oh, I just like you. As a, if you like a girl in elementary school, you can just touch her however you wanted to. And that's not okay. And it's not good, but that's how we were trained to normalize to think. And I thought that was okay when I was an 8 or 9-year-old or in the second and third grade. So having young kids educated on consent and what's okay, what's inappropriate, and other aspects of sex, and not just the body part aspect of things, is very important. Not just the biology aspect of it, but the cultural aspect of it as well is just as maybe even more important.
Because Justin grew up in Detroit, I grew up in Flint, and then I went to school also in Rochester. But both of us had the experience in middle school being asked, what is our body count? Which basically is how many people have we had sex with in middle school. And it's like mind blowing thinking of it now, looking at my siblings at 12 and 13 I can't even imagine them doing that, and how it was extremely normalized for us of, if you weren't sexually active at 13, then something's wrong with you. And I just think that could be a part of the bigger picture as well.
So sex and being sexualized is happening at a young age. And so if social workers or those responsible for care of young people in foster care are not asking about it, then the education is left to the streets, if you will.
Literally.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for that. Let's so our next question, excerpt, and read is actually about multi-generational trauma. And so Justin's going to take us through an excerpt that's on page 159.
Yes, of course. So in counseling, I discovered that addiction is often a result of unresolved trauma and other mental health issues. Through conversations with my brother, I learned that my mother has survived sexual abuse that mirrored some of the abuse Alexis had experienced in her childhood. He told me that my mom was sexually assaulted almost daily by her stepmother. And it doesn't say this part in the book, but she was pretty much sexually tortured throughout her childhood. So my mother never spoke about her abuse until a few years ago at age 54, during a casual conversation with Khalil. She began abusing drugs at the age of 18, around the same time she became pregnant with Dylan. That year, she also attempted suicide by shooting herself in the head. It was my responsibility to stop internalizing childhood trauma and start seeing it as separate from my inherent value, not a reflection of it.
Thank you, Justin. It's powerful to think of children in the context of intergenerational experiences that are still alive with parents and sometimes even grandparents. So I'm curious, what was your process then, Justin, of discovering how your childhood was linked to this generational trauma? And that including forgiveness and acceptance, which you have reached in your life. And when you look back, again, speaking to social work educators, how did social workers help you in understanding the intergenerational context of your experience? And what could social workers have done differently?
So that's a few different questions. I'll try to tackle it one by one. If I miss anything, just please follow up on what I missed. But as far as the how did I start to recognize this, I remember throughout middle school and high school, when I started to become more involved with women or girls at that time in middle school, I noticed that even in high school, once I started to develop even a decent relationship, not even that personal, I started to open up and share so much of my emotional trauma and my mental health about what I was going through. And of course, as you know, you're in late middle school or early high school, so you're hearing the things that I've experienced about my mom not being around, being in foster care, and all this trauma. If you're hearing this from somebody, you don't know what to do with it, and you're obviously overwhelmed. So I think as I reflect as a young adult on those experiences, and when I write about this in the book, I started to notice that because I didn't have my mom actively involved in my life, but she was around and maybe she'll call here and there, but she continued to use and abuse drugs. One thing that I noticed is that I began to try to fill that void in relationships and looking for my partner, even though I'm in middle school, high school, this is not really a partner, but looking for a romantic relationship to fill the void of a mother. And that's what I see so much. And I won't call any of my family out, but that's what I see so much in my family and some of my friends, and even Alexis can probably talk. She talked a bit about that in the book of her romantic partner in her abusive relationship treated her as if she was a mother a lot of times, and I think that's what I was starting to do. And for young men who don't have an active mother in their life, or maybe experience neglect in their life with their mother, I think they try to look for partners to fill the role of a mother and take care of them and love them the way their mother should have. And I think that's where I started to kind of do that. And as it relates to kind of multi-generational trauma, I noticed in my mom's life when I started to get to forgiveness was that for a long time, I viewed her as, why is she doing this to me? Why is she treating me like this? Why is she, why did she put us through what we went through? And I started to notice that it was really um, the things that she went through throughout her childhood, uh, the things she went through throughout her childhood with sexual abuse and trauma and everything, that was very extreme. With her being tortured, being beaten, and so many other things, that was the extreme. And for her to get to a point in her adulthood where she was, the term that I use and is kind of known, I don't know if this is the medical term, but somewhat of a functional addict, where she's abusing drugs, but she can kind of hide it and not show it as much. For her to get to that point where she's simply able to pay her bills and get by each month, whether it's through food stamps, government assistance, whatever, she's simply able to get by and live in her apartment, no matter how bad a condition she's in or life she's living. She's just able to get by, that she's satisfied, because in her mindset, she tells me that she told us this before, and you read about it in the book. She has gone through so much that she's okay with where she was, being a functional addict. And that being normalized and okay was passed down to myself and my siblings, with just accepting the bare minimum of, okay, I'm doing better than what I was, so it must be acceptable. She's not being sexually abused and tortured anymore. She's just a functional addict, and that's how she's dealing with her trauma, so it must be okay and acceptable. And we get to a point where just okay and acceptable and getting by is okay, but we don't deal with those issues, those insecurity and that trauma. So it becomes passed down and becomes multi-generational trauma.
Mhm. Oh, don't forget about the other part.
Oh yeah, so
Multi-generational trauma.
okay, so also with the multi-generational trauma is on my dad's side, there are two to three generations of domestic violence. So not being able to, for men, not being able to express ourselves and our downfalls and so many other things that's going wrong in our lives, not being able to cope with that trauma and those emotional issues. I think that social workers could work to provide more avenues to express anger, to express sadness, to express depression, provide more resources for young men and women to do that. So a lot of times I speak for young men, we think we can bottle up those emotions and handle it in a different way. But a lot of times that is expressed in alcoholism and domestic violence, where you're taking your anger out and your issues out on your partner. And I believe that's one of just a couple of the reasons why domestic violence has been passed down generationally within my family to where I even see it in my siblings now.
Thank you for that. You know, you're speaking to the layers of generational both suffering and then missed opportunity, and so how that gets compounded on the next generation of children. And I want to say this to the social work educators. One of the impacts of this book on me, so being a social work professor, having created the See the Scholars program, and having these two amazing young people be supported by that program. When I read the book, I was like, oh my gosh, that we can create these opportunities for young people, and we will never know like the layers of intergenerational burden that they carry, and then the many different obstacles and burdens that are happening. So we can create these platforms and opportunities and provide resources. And part of the lesson is, sometimes we have to learn as social workers how to get out of the way and allow you who, at a young age, Justin, recognizing this generational increments affecting your life, and that it needs to stop with you. It needs to change. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to move to the last excerpt, and then we're going to open this up to questions. So this last reading will be Alexis, and this is sort of rounding out really an excerpt that is sharing on sort of how does one overcome all of these circumstances and obstacles and challenges in life. So this is coming from page 208. Alexis.
Thank you. And it says, about 2 months into our relationship, Justin and I had our first big argument. Almost naturally, I raised my voice and yelled at him as I was used to doing. Only concerned with expressing my own feelings, I said whatever came to mind. Without saying anything, Justin walked out of my apartment. I was left confused and short of words. I didn't know what to do. He didn't engage, yell back, or call me names. I just stood there staring at the waves in the carpet before running to my bed, terrified that meant we were breaking up. I cried for 30 minutes until he walked back into my room. I will never forget what he said. I would never speak to you that way because I respect you. I grew up with everyone yelling and hitting each other, and I promised myself that I would never do that. So I expect you not to do that either. If that's not something you can do, then we shouldn't be together. I admired his willingness to set boundaries and expectations for our relationship.
It was a defining moment.
The biggest
so the two of you point out in the book, 1 in 3 adolescents in the US is a victim of emotional, sexual, or physical abuse by a romantic partner. Mm-hmm. So with social workers in mind that are serving survivors, what would you want them to know about your process of overcoming and finding resilience? And what are the personal and environmental factors to consider?
Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, so much of what I learned about my worth and my value all came through observation of those around me, and also what I learned through media, through my family, things like that. And I think what we oftentimes forget, even as, foster youth, probably out of rebellion a bit, but social workers are really a part of our community and play an important role in being sort of that example while providing resources and being there as an active part in our success and moving us forward. And so I always would recommend doing activities with the youth, not just handing them a piece of paper or say, here, do this, and I'll pick it up next time I come, but actually do something with them to help them understand, different aspects. And for myself, what I did in therapy, which I got it only because of therapy when I was 22. I wish I would have gotten this when I was a lot younger, but I had a therapist hand me, or we did it actually together. It was an activity on, it was like a T-chart almost, where on the left side it was what is in a healthy relationship and what is an unhealthy relationship, and to assess the relationship that I'm in, which I was still in that abusive relationship. And that was the first time that I really saw on paper, I'm a visual learner, and I saw how absolutely unhealthy and destructive that relationship was. But what if I would have had these conversations a lot earlier? And another thing that was extremely helpful, but again, I only learned about through MYOI, and that was after, I don't know, I probably had 10 workers by this time, and one mentioned coincidentally about MYOI, which is Michigan Youth Opportunity Initiative. And it's a sort of a club for foster youth to get together, to meet amongst themselves and meet other people. And before that, I felt so incredibly alone because I never met another foster youth. And an activity that we did with the MYOI was they brought in a panel of individuals who are in relationships, from dating all the way up to married 20 years, and just watching their body language, watching the way they communicate with each other, giving that advice. That was so pivotal to me, and learning more about healthy and unhealthy relationships, because I was never exposed to that really until almost college. And so I think that social workers can absolutely be a part of that conversation and help to kind of form these relationships, these bonds, and this knowledge, and push that forward, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing I want to add to that is, I think for a lot of people who are in certain relationships, as you can see, how I kind of described it before, of people who are in abusive relationships, they may see their partner as filling the void, or they're dependent. And there are a lot of times, even for a teenage youth, they're dependent on them for emotional needs, for mental needs. They may have grown comfortable with that form of abuse to where they feel like they can tolerate that a lot of times. And working through the process of redefining that normal, so to speak, no pun intended, redefining that normal of a relationship and a dynamic that, Alexis talked about, and the components that should go into a relationship, of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So doing that T-chart activity about what's healthy, what goes in a healthy relationship, what's not in a healthy relationship, and just the easy components. Not even always telling them the answer, what they should do, like you need to run, you need to leave, but just helping them evaluate that for themselves and understand, like, okay, you've listed all these unhealthy traits that are in your relationship. With this information, what are you going to do with that? But also providing them outlets and resources for them to leave that relationship, because they may feel attached and that their partner that's abusing them, that they need them for whatever reason. So providing them outlets and resources so they can't escape and leave that relationship, I think, is important.
You guys you're speaking about something that we learned in the CETA Scholars Program actually early on, is that, the students were arriving with like an amazing amount of perspective and resources and ideas. But the model that we had at the time was this notion of students needed remedial help. They needed, that they needed extra to support in learning things that they didn't learn well. And what we realized was that actually was a faulty assumption. And that in fact, what you just described, Alexis, was that you didn't have exposure to a healthy relationship to be able to draw in what are the qualities of a healthy relationship that you could emulate, right? So we actually named those exposure gaps, but I'm recognizing you guys are labeling that as redefining normal. So before we move to the questions of our participants, do you each want to just say a little bit more about the title of the book, Redefining Normal, and what the message is behind that?
She always looked at me to say it. So the
He's got it down pat.
but the concept of redefining normal is that each and every individual has an idea of their normal based on their family influence, the influence of their community, influence of society overall. So we all have this idea and concept of normal and the things that are set before us and expected of us. For myself, as an example, being Black, society has expectations of us. Um, Being coming from poverty, society has expectations of us. Coming from, some of the trauma that we've gone through, whether, domestic violence is generational, drug abuse is generational. Well, all this information, before you even see me, you've heard of me, you know my name, you can kind of expect where I'll be in life. And that's kind of when you read the book, before each chapter, there's statistics, whether it's 1 in 3 Black men go to jail or prison, foster care, young women in foster care become pregnant by a certain age, or 17 or 18, I don't know the specific age, but all these statistics and things that were set before us, before a lot of times we were even born or we were young children. So we all have a concept of normal. Each and every person has a concept of normal. But for us, our foundation and concept of normal was an unhealthy concept. So how does an individual go through the process of redefining that normal, redefining their identity, redefining their perspective on life altogether, when this is what they've been grounded in? This is their foundation of who they are and their normal, and something they've seen on a daily basis, seen in their parents, in their friends. If all of Alexis' friends and family and everyone around her since she was a little girl, 5 or 6 years old, telling her who she should be as a woman, and that is the unhealthy idea and definition, then ultimately it's natural. It'll be almost natural for her to live that out throughout her adulthood. But we go through the process of internalizing that normal and expressing it in a negative way. And we are open and honest about our mistakes and transparent with our experiences. And we also go through the process of changing that normal. What are the factors and things that helped us kind of identify what was the wrong in our situation, what was wrong and unhealthy in our situation, and providing us the opportunity to change that and become successful, at least what we believe we are today. So we go through that process of from childhood, the normal part and how it was normalized, to how we are now, and looking from the outside, looking into unhealthy situations, whether it's in our friend group, whether it's in our with our families, with our family members and siblings, in different areas like that.
Thank you. Lovely. So ET, I'm going to, ET is monitoring our chat. If you have a question, a participant, you can also raise your hand, but I'm actually going to invite ET to sort of help us with bringing questions forward at this point.
Hi, so we have had one question so far in the chat from Sean Elliott, and they were following up asking about social workers taking part in discussing sexuality. And they were wondering, how would you propose that social workers get the training and having this kind of conversation?
That's a tough question.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, we would say all of our suggestions are based on interactions and personal experiences with counselors and therapists and people who had that experience in those areas. So we're by no means experts, but just experts with our experience and things that we've gone through and somewhat how to work through it. So we would say, I mean, really try to gather as much information as possible before you make that initial interaction. Try to gather as much information about identity and sexuality and trauma. Try to gather that information from different experts, and people go through those trainings and volunteer yourself to do those different trainings. Even if you are interacting with someone of a different race, go through those trainings, the race training, and becoming aware and informed on different things before you make that interaction, because you don't want to contribute to trauma and say the wrong thing and say things that you didn't mean to have that impact, but you had that impact and you said that thing, that the thing you weren't supposed to say. So go through the training and get the information and be prepared as possible before you go through, go and get into those circumstances and situations. Will always come from a perspective of trying to learn more, because even though you may have a certain base of information and knowledge, you may be dealing with someone who may operate in a different way. Like, for example, some Black people may prefer African American as opposed to Black, vice versa. So you may need to educate yourself on what they prefer. And even when you do educate yourself, you still ask, what do you prefer? I think asking questions to a degree can always be helpful, but always try to come in a respectful way, if that makes sense. I know that can be a lot, but yeah.
I think I want to add this because I think Sean, and I'll invite you to come forward if you want to add more to that question, but the reality is social work education curriculum doesn't specifically teach social workers how to address, assess, or educate or intervene with children on sexual development. And so one of the things I think that this book can help bring into the classroom and bring into learning is that we in our curriculum need to get with the times, if you will, and that children are exposed and experiencing sex and being sexualized at much younger ages. And so it's actually a topic that can't be ignored. So there's probably, like the trainings that you're referring to, Justin, I don't know that they exist yet. So I would suggest that this is a call to social work educators that we need to actually add in content and practical ways to talk with children and educate caregivers.
Mhm.
Sean, did you want to add anything more?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And when I heard you talking, Justin and Alexis, I heard you mention if only, if only I had known then. And it just kind of made me think about, how you were expressing it from your lived experience perspective, saying, okay, well, if only that had occurred, maybe I could have avoided this. Maybe I could have had a healthier view, a healthier perspective on how to approach these things. And yet, as Yvonne mentioned, a lot of this is not within the educational material. I'm speaking at a similar type of conference in May, and and that's why I thought I'd get some ideas from you with this, because I'm thinking about many social workers may look at this as well, that's part of another group, the othering concept, and they don't necessarily know how to have that discussion. And if it's not within the training, yet it's such an important need, like where's the balance? It's so important, but we don't know how to approach it because we don't have the training, or maybe because social workers are going, yeah, but that's I can't go into that space, because what if it's misunderstood? What if I misrepresent it? Like, for an example, Justin, like if I, as a male social worker, have that discussion with a female child, that's going to send off warning bells and maybe not go the way that it should. So, like, what are some practical ways that maybe social workers can start opening this discussion a little bit more?
Mhm. That's a really great question.
I,
You go, Yvonne.
well, so here's my thought, because there's a follow-up question in the chat about should training for social workers specifically related to foster care survivors be included in the graduate curriculum? And then another question on, what are the characteristics and or skills for effective and compassionate social worker to work with vulnerable youth in the foster care system? And I would say, so based on the experience of developing the CETA Scholars Program, is we would ask you, and so not ask you to develop the curriculum, but I think if we were to invite you and Justin to speak to a group of youth who are currently in care, what would you tell them about sex education, about intergenerational trauma? Because I think therein lies the the kernels of truth that social workers need to be attuned to, and make sure the message gets to youth, whether they are the deliverers of that message or whether they need to create opportunities for youth to be in the presence of others who can share.
Mhm.
So that's my comment.
Mhm.
So I'm really asking you guys, what can you offer to say what do social workers need to know to equip youth in care with this orientation, the skills that they need?
I think Alexis can really speak to the control and the autonomy piece, because excuse my cat in the background, she needs some attention. But I think Alexis can really speak to the sense of control, because when you've experienced sexual trauma, you feel as if, and I'm speaking somewhat from the outside looking in, I've been sexualized at a young age, but I don't think I can identify as a sexual assault survivor and experience serious sexual trauma. But I think you can really speak to a sense of control. We can try to help people get back in their life, because when you were exposed to that at a young age and that's taken away from you, you feel that your sense of control and autonomy has been taken away, and your body, someone took your body away and controlled that and took advantage of that, especially people who are trusted, like a dad or an uncle or a mother or something like that. So can you maybe talk to a piece about regaining that control and autonomy over your body, over your mind, and over your identity moving forward?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that even came from the process of me, working through that and stuff. There's a lot of different activities that I did and I worked through. There was one that I did also where I was with one of my counselors that basically I write down all of the traumas that sort of have happened to me on a timeline, and it's like a long banner, but we made this like long banner of all these different traumas that I've gone through, and kind of remembering the dates of when things happen and remembering sort of details of when things happen. And at the end, we were supposed to burn it or bury it. And I did neither, because I saw it as an opportunity to actually, as a point of reflection of, wow, look at how far I've come. And so I think working with young people on understanding where have you come from, what traumas have you gone through, and then helping them understand, well, that doesn't mean that it defines you. Like, even though I was sexualized, even though I had sexual assault and trauma and all these things happened to me, that doesn't mean that's what I'm going to become. And sharing those risk factors and things like such as ACEs, and we talk about those a lot with youth. And so many people are, their minds are blown, because this is not just common knowledge that people are talking about. And it's also not common knowledge on healthy and unhealthy relationships as it is. And I was speaking with a woman yesterday in Kalamazoo, and she runs a entrepreneurship program. And she was mentioning how she was in an abusive relationship. And when she, even as an adult, are trying to reach out to other people on advice, they just don't, like, she's just getting terrible advice, or nobody even knows what a healthy relationship is or looks like, because it's not normalized in our community. And so I think it could just honestly be a lot of conversations. And that's what we try to focus our presentations on when we do, especially meet with young people, because we can come in with our lived experience, but they have their own lived experience that's probably completely different than ours, even though there may be some intersections and commonalities, but at the end of the day, it's going to be different. And so listening and trying to understand where they're coming from, and just hear different perspectives, and bring in our knowledge that we do have. And that's what, social workers have, this common knowledge and this basis, this foundation that they're coming in with. But because that sexual aspect of teaching or learning about those things are not talked about, that's when I see it being pushed off on other people and not feeling comfortable having those conversations, as Sean mentioned, maybe being a male trying to talk with females. But that's when you can work as a community, which is what you all are for us, of, why don't you bring in other people that maybe identify the same as what they identify with, and try to have those conversations, because they need to be had. But if everybody's just pawning it off, then it's not going to be done.
And just even adding to that is just you talked a bit about understanding that this is a part of your experience, but doesn't consume who you are. I think a lot of youth are caught up with, this is all that I am. I'm a victim and I'm going through this, and this is who I am. but you've even displayed how you can be victorious over those things and use it to your advantage. Not that, of course, you didn't want this to happen to you, but you won't let this completely take hold of your identity and your future moving forward. You get to shape your future, and though your past was controlled and manipulated by someone else, you get to influence and dictate your future and who you are and who you influence moving forward, while also saying that you get the power and opportunity to influence other people and maybe help them avoid some of the circumstances that you succumb to. So, throughout the book, we always, and even during our presentations, we have participants kind of identify who are some of the people who could have helped us avoid some of those downfalls and some of those struggles. And having those people who you talk to, you interact with, see themselves as an ally to other people who've experienced those things, and develop the characteristics and within them to kind of build that armor and build that strength and build that muscle to where they can be allies to other people experiencing some of those same things and help them avoid that, because there were neighbors, cousins, friends in our lives who could have kind of helped us in those circumstances and in those experiences, but they ignored it when they saw the signs. So helping them become aware of the signs, become advocates, and dictate their future moving forward so they can prevent some of those things for other people, I think will be extremely important.
Thank you for that. And actually for that exchange. So I think we all just got to witness sort of how the conversation for healing and support and understanding just is continues between the two of you as you support one another. I do want to draw out on one thing that Alexis made the point, and Justin, you're emphasizing as well. And it seems that, that each of you grew up in a neighborhood, in a community, in a school system, in a foster care system. And yet the burdens of which you are individually healing from, you're doing the heavy lifting. So Alexis, you're describing that, taking those experiences into one-to-one therapy. Mm-hmm. And I think this is an area that another challenge for us in the social work field is to make sure that we offer our clients, our community members, the option and the privacy for personal healing, but that we have to message that this is not an individual problem, and that it isn't for individuals to carry fully the burden of those experiences which they've endured through impoverished neighborhoods, through communities that have gaps and holes. So I just really want to stress that and acknowledge that individuals carry the weight of that, and social work could have a bigger role in strengthening understanding about where our communities have gaps and have failed. Mm-hmm. So we have a few more minutes. Is there another question that wants to come forward?
I see there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I think the next one came from Dr. Diaknu, and it says, in your opinion, what should be the characteristics and or skills of an effective and compassionate social worker who works with vulnerable youth who are in the foster care system?
I noticed with a lot of my social workers that they didn't intend to be with me for a long time. And so there was always sort of this, I don't know, like a wall there where it was like, I'm here to do what I need to do and then gone. And I would try to pull them aside and say, like, I need to talk to you, or like, this is the situation. And I remember with like probably my first 5 social workers, I was like, please get me out of this house when I was with my aunt and uncle. It was an unhealthy environment, but all of them said, you're in a good school. This is a nice house. You need to make it work. And so I just gave up. And just knowing that was kind of cycled through a lot of workers. And I was just like, and I just got to a point where I just wouldn't even talk. I would just sign the papers and like, they would just leave. And so there wasn't even that conversation or check-in really, or anything. up until I was actually kicked out of my uncle's house as a junior in high school, and I had one social worker that advocated for me more than any other one. And she said, Alexis, I have the perfect family for you. Just hold on. And she really advocated for me more than any other worker. And she helped me connect with my forever family who ended up adopting me. And it was because of that advocacy that she saw that pairing. She saw, that relationship or potential relationship moving forward. And so I think it comes down to a lot of that compassion, that pure advocacy that's in you to want the best for the youth, and not just I have so many youth, I can't really get to them all, or you don't want to connect too deeply with each one because you might not be with them for a while. But I think we're just craving like this, I don't know, insatiate need for like love and caring, and the more people that can give it to us, the more love and support, and I don't know, any sort of condition of love that we can possibly get, I think is invaluable, because as I mentioned, you guys are all a part of our community. And so if you even planting a seed of, you can do great things, or planting that positivity is so incredibly important. But I didn't really have those relationships with a lot of my workers. I don't know what your.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even count how many workers I've had, so I don't even want to get into that. But I think just what will be important is the consistency piece. Consistency and giving options, and giving youth a sense of control. I mean, we've had so many people from social workers, case workers, attorneys, and foster parents, and so many people in control of our lives telling us what to do. And from my personal experience, and I'll talk about this in the book, of foster parents telling me that you're eating my food, you're living in my house, you're sleeping in my bed. And it's just like all control stripped away from you. So when you're interacting with youth, foster care youth, or anybody, work towards trying to give them that sense of control back, giving them options on what do you want to do today, what does your career look like, or just providing them with different options on what they can do, what they can be, what direction they want to go. So I think that sense of control is very much needed, but also the consistency of just you constantly being there, being consistent and transparent. We know you may have a lot on your plate, and that's completely understandable. And I think you should be open, or decently, not too open about what you have going on. You want to keep the focus on them, of course, but you want to be transparent, but try your best to be consistent. And that's really the goal.
All right. And so thank you all for participating today. And I want to just acknowledge what you're saying is every interaction with the youth is going to leave a mark. So make sure it actually leaves a good one. And Alexis, you are speaking to that insatiable human need for love and connection that each and every one of us has. So thank you both for your time today, for helping to inform social work educators. This is the book. I'll be using it with my students in field in the fall. There's a lot of different options to learn, grow from theory to practice, assessment, and even good case information for policy work. So thank you all for your time today. We're grateful, ET, for being in the background, for making this go smoothly. We wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.